So a lot of people have undoubtedly noticed that something has gone horribly, horribly wrong in our society. And by our society, I mean specifically America, the society where I live, and where I assume most people watching this video live. But I think that also has application, what I'm going to say here, to a lot of other countries as well in the world. So what I'm talking about is that it's very clear that a lot of people are struggling hard to be able to communicate in a way that isn't just unbridled madness. We are clearly seeing lots of people who are letting their emotions get the best of them, that they cannot articulate their thoughts in a way using language. They have to use force. And their only purpose of using language is to recruit other people into their emotional outbursts against things they don't like, but often cannot articulate why they don't like it in a way that is based on evidence and reason. A lot of people notice this about our education system.
A fourth grader asked their teacher, "Why do I need to learn how to read if AI can read for me?" Right now, 40% of fourth graders can't read.
I teach 8th grade history, and I have 110-ish students. 2 of them are reading on grade level right now. 18 of them are at a kindergarten level. 55 of those students are between a 2nd and 4th grade level. We were doing guided notes, supposed to be a real easy day. It was review. They wrote down Maryland was founded as a safe haven for Catholics. It was on the board. They wrote it down. And before we moved on, I call on a student and I ask, "Hey, where were the Catholics one more time?" And these students, what they do is they look at me and then they look at their notes and then they look at the board. They look back at their notes. And some of them never answered me. They never figured out the answer. It was wild. And I kept giving them hints, like rephrasing the question and saying, like, "It's in your notes. We just wrote it down. We just wrote it down. Where are the Catholics? It's on the board." And they never got it. They can't read their own notes. And I don't mean their handwriting. I mean, like, they can't make heads or tails of it on the page. These kids have a frightening ability for information to go from their eyes to their hands and not pass through the brain at all. What do we do, y'all? That ship is sailing across the ocean and there is no one at the wheel.
I looked up the actual numbers. Only 23% of fourth graders can read at a proficient level. Just 23%. Then we have the 8th graders. Only 26% are reading proficiently. After all the reforms, adding technology into the classrooms, and debating about funding, we're now at 40%.
And I'm here to tell you that it's not exclusively a problem just with young children. What we are seeing in society with all these adults who are running around crazy in the streets trying to fight the government over laws that were passed many decades ago and have been on the books for decades ago and were simply not being enforced, like, say, immigration law. The reason that we're seeing this is because a lot of people don't understand how to absorb new information or respond to changes of circumstance in a way that doesn't cause them to just have emotional tantrums.
I'm a basketball referee.
Albert Coffin is officiating when a disagreement erupts between players. There's a little pushing and shoving, but this comes at the end of the game.
There were several other players in the vicinity, and I stepped in and said, game's over, game's over.
And that's when one parent, angry about a Coffin call, decided to express his feelings in a very violent way.
A parent of one of the players came running at full speed and hit me in the back. It immediately threw me down face first onto the court.
They're not able to identify the correct, more mature, responsible civil ways to deal with these things. which is through our democratic legal process, instead of just, for example, taking a gun and shooting somebody because you don't like what they're saying. The whole reason why we have the type of society that we have, a republic with the right to free speech and with heavy restriction on the power of the courts and politicians and the people to do direct democracy, is to accommodate all of the defects of the individual person, who often behaves in a way that is more selfish and unconsidering of the welfare of the society that they live in, which gives them all the benefits and privileges that they have, like the fact that our money doesn't just evaporate into worthless paper overnight. We have a whole system which is very complex and requires being able to understand complex ideas to know how to function within that society. And unfortunately, our education system, not exclusively public education, I'm even talking about high-priced private education, is failing to teach a lot of people how to operate in our society in a mature way. And we're going to talk about that. So, this presentation is using ideas that I talk about in my book, Common Humanity. And what I mean by common humanity is that there are basically two different ways that groups form shared identity of the members of those groups. The most common way is common enemy framework, where we form shared identity based on who we don't like. Okay? Generally, you can consider the Democrat Party and the Republican Party of the United States to basically be this. These guys often are just trying to be the opposite of the other in order to win elections. It didn't start out that way. Originally, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party were based on shared values, differences in political policies that they were promoting. The Republican Party, for example, was originally formed about the issue of slavery. It was about trying to end slavery in society because the institution of slavery didn't align with liberalism political philosophy that the country was founded upon, where people have to have a right to life, liberty, and property. And it was very obvious that people who are enslaved don't have liberty. This was one of the big problems with the formation of the United States, is that a large number of powerful political factions wanted to continue to own slaves, basically, and the other side didn't. And the topic was basically shelved at the federal level and pushed down to be a state rights issue, on the hope that the solution could more organically be resolved over time. Fortunately, that didn't happen. What happened is we had to have a civil war to force the southern states into compliance with federal law that outlawed slavery. That's what happened. Over time, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party have shifted away from being just about their shared values of the group members, their principles like liberty, and their interpretation of what liberty should even mean, to instead just be, well, if the Republican Party is favoring deregulation of capitalist markets, then the Democrat Party needs to be the opposite of that to appeal to the people who don't agree with that. And this has become common enemy shared frameworks, essentially. And a lot of people have staked their entire identity, their personal identity as a person, based on what political faction they're voting for and what issues those politicians that they like are saying, instead of having a real meaningful scrutiny of the claims of the politicians and whether anything that they're saying makes any goddamn sense at all. Common humanity is about shared identity based upon values that are shared by the members. It does not require an enemy to have shared identity around. This presentation here is really going to be talking about how our education system is failing to teach people how to be able to form common humanity groups about shared identity instead of just forming identity based on who you don't like and the things that you don't like, to be the opposite of what you don't like, essentially. So there's basically two things that the education system is supposed to teach people. The first is skills, and the second is maturity. And we're failing to teach people maturity when we teach them skills, which is making their ability to learn those skills frustrated and sometimes impossible. Okay? So what do I mean by this? We have horizontal growth for a person and a vertical growth path for a person. And you need both of these things to become a very educated person in the complex type of society that we have that is highly technical because we have a high dependence upon tool usage, technology. Things have become very, very complicated. I mean, just trying to drive from one end of the road, from one end of town to another part of town requires not just being able to memorize all the laws of how to operate a motor vehicle. It also requires a certain level of maturity so that you don't just get angry and crash your car into somebody else in a fit of rage.
This video of Michael Murray crashing his newly purchased car through the showroom is not something he's proud of.
I know me crashing into that car, into that building was wrong.
But Murray says he is drained emotionally, mentally, and financially.
So, horizontal growth. You're adding knowledge, learning facts, basically, about the world and why those things are facts. So it's kind of like if a person is an operating system, you're adding new apps to your phone, okay? If you think of of a person as a phone, you're installing new applications on that phone when you have horizontal growth of that person. And this is primarily what schools focus on teaching people. They primarily, overwhelmingly focus on teaching people to learn facts. On the other hand, what schools have stopped teaching people, because schools have ceased to become a disciplined environment where rules are enforced fairly and strictly to encourage maturity, as well as failures in the homes of the students themselves, the kids who are attending the schools. I mean, if a teacher punishes you, it doesn't mean that the kid cares. If the parents at home don't care about the kid performing poorly in academics and being disruptive in class or being kicked out of school, if their home life is unstructured and undisciplined and not reinforcing the growth of their maturity, their ego development, then it doesn't matter what any of the teachers do at school, trying to teach them facts and skills and knowledge. The kids aren't going to pick it up, and the kids aren't going to become educated.
The teacher shot by a 6-year-old student takes the stand today and relives her ordeal.
I thought I was dying.
The student was suspended for a day. She says the student and his mother apologized for slamming the phone, and he was allowed to return to school. That's when he shot her.
Is that why you lifted your hand? Did you know what was about to happen? Yes.
All right, take a look at this. Another video has surfaced showing the latest assault on a Baltimore City Schools employee. This happened at Baltimore Polytechnic Institute in Northwest Baltimore.
This is what happened to a teacher who took away a student's phone. The student first pepper sprayed her teacher in the classroom before doing it again in the hallway as she demanded her phone back. She apparently had her phone taken away for Googling test answers.
Police are now investigating after the woman named Korshanda and her son were viciously attacked near 106th and Bensley. That's just a couple blocks away from the elementary school. It happened yesterday shortly after dismissal. A group of kids approached them and started punching and kicking them. Korshanda says her son has been bullied at Wright and claims the administration has not done enough to protect him.
And it's a failure of both the school systems and the parents at home doing vertical growth with the kids that were having problems. And this didn't just happen overnight Again, we don't have people rioting in the streets over things that they shouldn't be doing, attacking police officers in the streets and thinking they have a right to do that, killing people, okay, in a democracy, in a republic, because they don't like the outcome of an election. This didn't happen overnight. It's because our system has been failing to do this for a very long time. I'd say at least about 40 years we started failing. This is when things started going wrong. Okay? So you need to have vertical growth too in education. You have to have people who aren't just installing new apps to their phone's operating system. They need to update their entire operating system to have more capability. Think of a person again as a phone. If you just leave your operating system, as less effective, you can't install as many apps into it. Some of the apps won't work because they require more advanced operating system. If lots of people are operating at DOS, they're not going to be able to install the same programs as people who are using the latest version of Windows. Okay? That's an analogy for you. So, ego development theory, which is what we're going to talk about with that growth of a person's operating system. This is based upon very well-defined research, which I talk about in my book, Common Humanity, based on the research of primarily two women, Jane Loevinger, who started her work in the 70s, and Susanne Cook-Greuter, who published a number of papers improving and expanding upon Jane Loevinger's studies with additional meta-analysis. Ego doesn't just mean arrogance, okay? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a person's internal operating system, the way that they process information and create meaning from that information, okay? The way that they interpret reality. That's what we're talking about here. And their center of gravity is their consciousness, the way that they're thinking about life. That's what ego is, okay? It's what stabilizes you in society. If you don't have a very well-developed ego, you're going to be making tantrums and screaming and yelling whenever you get discomforted, whenever things don't go the right way you want them to go. That's what a lower ego level of development represents. It doesn't mean, of course, that a person can never become angry. At some point, if somebody or something upsets you enough, of course you're going to get angry about it. What I'm talking about is people who fly off the handle when a cashier doesn't get their order right at McDonald's, or they don't like some government policy, so the first thing they can think to do is go into the streets and yell and scream and be violent against other people. So, it's not just about learning facts. We have to have some emotional development too. There are identifiable stages based on this research, and the research is very good. It comes out of empirical psychology, and it's very, very well justified. There are basically three main stage areas, which is the pre-conventional, which is basically where very young children are capable of. And then you have conventional, which is where people who are adults are capable of, and then post-conventional, which generally, I think people in their 20s can still be capable of it too, but you often only see this in people who are in their 30s and 40s and up. Of course, this doesn't mean that just because somebody is older that they are inherently in a higher stage of ego development. I think this problems that we're seeing in society is a lot of adults are actually operating in these earlier stages, the pre-conventional stages, that young children operate in, and that's why they're so immature. It's not a circular reason observation. We're going to get into some of this here. Here is a great real-world example of somebody who is stuck in one of these lower stages of ego development, who has a more immature ego and is judging facts based on what's popular in their peer group and not based on an independent analysis of the facts. This is Don Lemon, who's a CNN reporter of sorts. And here he is trying to convince people on the street that being illegally in the United States is not actually a crime. And he gets called out for how that's wrong. And he still will refuse to accept it.
Okay, crossing the border illegally is not a crime?
No, it's not a criminal act. Okay. It's a misdemeanor.
So why are they being sent back and saying that they're breaking the law?
That's the point.
Okay, as somebody that
we don't know if they're breaking the law because they won't tell. There's no due process. Where's the evidence? That's the whole point. And if they are breaking the law, most people will say, okay, then they need to go if they're criminals. But if they're not, why are they being rounded up and sent out? Especially when he promised to deport the criminals, and now he's not doing that.
Yeah, I don't think we're going.
Misdemeanor is not a crime.
Yeah.
So misdemeanor is not
it's
a crime?
It's not a criminal act, no. If you get charged with a misdemeanor, that's not a criminal act.
So why get charged at all then, if it's not a criminal act?
Because we have different levels of crime. Everything is not the same.
So it is crime.
No,
it's just
we have different levels of. I shouldn't say crime, but it's not. It's not a crime. You're not breaking the law. I mean, you are breaking the law, but it's not a criminal act.
So it's breaking the law.
It's
no,
the law,
you're not breaking the law.
The misdemeanor is not breaking the law.
No.
If you're speeding, drinking, get pulled over, DUI.
That's not a criminal act. Well, no. If you're speeding, is a misdemeanor.
It's a misdemeanor. Right. So it's still breaking the law.
Okay, well, if you want to qualify that, we're doing semantics. But what I'm saying, but what I'm trying to tell you is everything is not the same. It's all not one thing.
But is it the law?
What is it? The law that what?
Is it a law to come over legally? Is there a law?
There are rules that are processes that you should follow. Yeah, so you're breaking rules. You're breaking the rules, but you're not necessarily breaking a law.
So what happens when you break the rules?
Then you suffer the consequences. But the consequences should not. Look, no one is saying no one should suffer the consequences. You guys are getting things mixed up.
So basically, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. This is the problem in our society right now. We have a lot of adults who, for lack of a better analogy, basically think like children. They think like children do. They don't think like a fully capable grown adult does. And what is true in their worldview is based on what makes them popular with their peers, and not so much what is actually true. They don't, even when they are confronted with the facts of a situation, even when they admit and acknowledge those facts, they can't put two and two together. They will still double down on their special pleading fallacies, their special definitions, their relativist terms that are popular with the in-group that they're part of, and not based on any objective analysis of the facts. That's what's wrong with society here. We have people who are simply not utilizing their full potential as a person and are operating in a very immature way. So, without getting too much into the weeds just yet, it's a tiered way of thinking about the world. So we start out as very impulsive and self-protective as young children, infants, toddlers. These are impulsive and self-protective stages. And then we have tier 2, which involves the conformist stage and the expert stage, which are similar but have differences that we'll get into. And people form their identity very much based on tribalism, which is different than very young children who are only capable of thinking about themselves versus the entire world. And they're not able to articulate that individual people in the world are separate from other things in the world. They're very just focused on their own wants and needs, which is different than the conventional stages of the tier 2, where people understand that they're part of a group of people, but the way they interact with those people and other people outside that group differs. And then you have stage 3, which is the achiever stage, individualist and autonomous stages. This is generally people who are at least usually over the age of 20. Doesn't mean teenagers aren't capable of it, but generally speaking, you find it mostly just people who are in their 20s and 30s who are capable of these stages, and up, of course. And this is the focus of common humanity group identity that I mentioned before. The lower stage, stage 2, is very much focused on tribalism, and where common enemy politics is extremely appealing, and I would say is actually what people do. They don't make group identity based on shared values. They do based upon their identity with that group and their opposition to another group of people outside that group. And it's because a lot of adults in our current society here in America are falling into tier 2 instead of tier 3, that we have all the problems that we're having, because they're not able to articulate themselves as being a separate person from that group. Their identity is based wholly in being a member of that group and what that group is opposed to. So let's dive into these earlier stages a bit more, okay? As I mentioned before, very young children, impulsive and self-protective. They're trying to get immediate rewards, or they're trying to avoid punishment and fears and things like that. Blame is always based on somebody else's problem. They don't take responsibility for their own poor decision makings. Babies are literally not capable of that often. It's only when they become older. And this is another problem a lot of people make. They assume very young children who have brains that clearly are not fully developed yet. That's why their brains are smaller than adults. Their head is literally not the same size as an adult, okay? Their brain's not fully developed yet. It's still building its neural connections. It's still developing itself. And they're not just tiny adults. They don't have the ability, all right? And they make lots of decisions based in very emotional, selfish, limited stage of ego development. And a person is supposed to grow out of that, but that's not always what happens, unfortunately. You have to be educated to grow out of these things. You have to learn lessons, and this can happen organically, but it's often best if it's taught. Just like all other knowledge that people have about the world. We're not born with the ability to communicate in English. It's something we have to learn. And even though we can understand English, we still have to sit down and learn how to understand written languages and the structure of languages and thought processes and things of that nature, okay? Then you have the stages I mentioned before, which is the crux of what we're going to focus on here, where you have a person who is probably, I'd say, at least around, first grade level and up, first grade to high school. They generally fall into this category where they're a conformist, okay? So their thinking about things is based on their want to fit in. They're compelled to view things a certain way in order to fit in, and not necessarily based upon what is objective reality. And even though you can teach them critical thinking, you can teach them the scientific method, most kids are not going to fully be able to grasp that because their brains are still developing. They're going to assume the scientific method is just some universal law because the teacher said so, and the teacher is giving me a reward for doing so. And if I want to be in the smart people group that the teachers are rewarding, then I need to believe what the teacher is saying. That's usually how this lower stage of ego development works. All right? It's about loyalty to the group. What the group leaders is saying is true. And that can be useful for teaching small children lots of information. But when kids never grow out of that and they become adults, that's when we start having tremendous amounts of problems in a democratic republic where you have to make your own choices in voting for our leaders, okay? It's not working out so well for us. So identity cannot just be based on group belonging, but yet that is precisely what's happening in our society right now, is we have a lot of people who are staying in these lower stages, these child stages of thinking. Their operating systems are not updating. Their moral compass, likewise, is defined by what people are telling them is right and wrong, and not based on any self-scrutiny of those claims. This is, of course, how we get a lot of faith-based religions, where just because it was written in the Bible and somebody told me when I was a small child that the Bible is true, and they never question it, that's stage 3, all right? They're really just trying to appeal peers and people that they respect, and they're extremely vulnerable to demagoguery, mob mentalities, and so forth. Above that, we still have a lower stage, but it's they're getting better, okay? They're updating their operating system a little bit more. They're starting to get things a little bit more, but they're not quite there yet, which is stage 4 of the expert. And this is a person who's very rules focused. They're very focused on applying the rules that they have learned during the previous stage 3 of development as a person. And they have a very rigid way of thinking that is, the rules that I learned are crystal clear and black and white, and they can apply some type of critical thinking, usually lower forms like deductive reasoning and abductive reasoning and things like that, but they're still very much dependent upon their value as a person, their identity as a person, on the mastery of these rules they were taught during stage 3, and not about scrutinizing any of those rules. This often creates academic tribalism, where students are just focused on mastering those rules, and they're not really thinking about whether what they were taught is accurate or not. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. Some kids are developing, and they're challenging dogma. This often happens in the teenage years. But what frequently happens is that kids don't actually advance into the next stages when they're rebelling against behavior. They're just adopting some other peer group's rules as their dogma. And they're not actually thinking about things critically at all. And again, lots of adults fall into this camp as well, and that's the problem that we're having in society. Lots of these common enemy groups, political groups, the political ideologies, they take advantage of people's inability to get out of stage 3 and stage 4, and it exploits their blind spots. Instead of them just trying to fit in, they're trying to be correct. They're trying to be what they think is correct, instead of understanding whether or not those ideas are correct in a rational, empirical based process. Okay? So, it makes them very susceptible to peer pressure. And this has been studied. It's a study by a scientist by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. He did a bunch of tests that are very relevant for ego development theory, where basically he put people into groups, and there was one person who was the point of the study, who was the test, basically. And the groups were filled with his own students who were plants. And the group was asked questions that were clearly, there was a clear correct answer, and there was a clearly wrong answer. And what he found is that when people were put into groups where all of the plants, like say there was 3 other people in the group, and they were all plants. They were not actual participants in the study, but the person who was participating in the study thought that they were. When those plants all gave the wrong answers, the person who was being studied also gave the wrong answer, even if that person would have given a different answer in a different group of people who all gave a different answer. So what he showed is that a lot of people refuse their own senses. They refuse their own ability to solve basic math problems like 2 + 2 = 4, for example. They'll ignore these things if everybody else in the group is in agreement that their own senses are wrong. There's conformity. And these are the people who are operating at these lower stages of ego development, stages 3 and 4. And there's a lot of adults who are in these stages where if you tell them something that is definitely wrong, and they should know that it's wrong based on how old they are, having gone through a public education system where they can do basic math equations. But if you put them into a group of a bunch of other people who are saying, no, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4, it equals 10, they'll say it equals 10 because their perception of what is true and what is rewarding and what they should do is based in their own senses, their own ability to scrutinize information. It's based in what the group is doing. And they don't even have to have any real ties to the group that they're in. People have a natural, instinctive ability to form a mob with other people they just met, if those other people are passionate enough about what they're talking about. And that is a problem with a republic such as we live in the United States. Okay? So polarization isn't just exchanges of ideas, it's a compulsion to avoid social isolation, and common enemy politics groups, they're exploiting this in society and motivating people to basically think that, up is down and down is up. So, with these people who are in the lower stages of thinking, it's very difficult to get them out of it if they've allowed themselves to mature, not mature, but to basically stay in the stage too long. The worst thing we have is teaching young kids that things are right because the teacher says they're right and because they're going to get rewarded for putting the right answers onto the test, and not teaching them how any of this information was formed. And this isn't necessarily such a problem with mathematics as it is with social studies and history. And that's what we're having a real big problem with, I think, the most in society, is the way that we teach history and social studies and things of that nature. Generally scientific facts, it's not correct. We're teaching people just to memorize things, and then later, if the person ever comes across new information that contradicts what the teacher in the classroom taught them, or what they learned in a YouTube video or some other nonsense, if the first information is contradicted by new information, they have a strong tendency to cling to that original information and not actually do a compare analysis, to use a science-based method of approach to determine whether the new information is actually more correct than the older information that they knew. So they'll engage in lots of logical fallacies like ad hominem, for example. They'll tell the other person that they're wrong because of some supposed moral failing or behavior that they don't like. I don't like your tone. You're talking to me with the wrong tone. They won't focus on whether or not the information is correct. They'll focus on other bullshit, basically. And a lot of that is creating a strawman argument, usually as ad hominem, which is, again, attacking the person. It's Latin for to the person. They're very rigid in their thinking process, and they often can't handle ambiguity at all. So this gets you a lot with faith-based religions, in my experience. Some people have to have some answer to how the universe came to be, even if that answer doesn't make any goddamn sense. If there's no evidence whatsoever for it, it doesn't matter to these people in the lower stages. They just need to have an answer. They're uncomfortable with ambiguity. They're uncomfortable with not having something that they can say to a question that they have. They become obsessed with having to have an answer to a question, even though sometimes we can't find an answer because we don't have enough information to have an answer. But when you're in these lower stages of ego development, you often can't think of it that way. You want to have information that makes you able to fit in with a group of people. You want to be part of the smart people. You want to be part of the group of people that you're friends with and your family with, who all have the same answer to a question. So you need to have the same answer to that question too, so you can be part of that group and reap the rewards of group membership. This is a behavior of lower stage development. I'm an atheist, personally. I can't tell you how the universe came about. We don't got enough information. And I'm fine with that. It doesn't matter to my life. It don't matter to your life either, okay? the mechanisms of common enemy politics really exploits people who want to fit in with a group. And the problem you often have with these groups, when you have people who are members of different groups that have different ways of thinking, different cultural behaviors that are not shared by another group, the tendency for people who are in lower ego development stages is to view those people as an enemy who are attacking my identity of choice because they disagree with it, or even may use politics to try to stop me from it. And a lot of the political divide that we have in the United States right now is because of different common enemy groups clashing with each other. And this has resulted in what's called pathocracy, which is a society ruled by the psychologically dysfunctional people. Political discourse that should be based upon civil rules of engagement and examination of the evidence alone, it instead is completely replaced by a friend versus enemy warfare, where if you don't agree with me, you can't be my friend, we're enemies, let us do battle to the death. That's essentially what happens. And the conformist fear and expert righteousness traits of these lower stages of thinking are exploited by the leaders of these groups, the pathocracists, okay? Politicians, sometimes nonprofit leaders, basically anybody who can benefit in some way by stoking the fires of hatred in a large group of people. If you're in a political group and you don't know who the leader is, just look at who's benefiting from your participation in the group. That'll tell you who the leader of the group is. Okay, so why does common enemy politics thrive so much with these group of people? It's because, unfortunately, there's a very large group of these people. It's not just children, adults. If you think about college, okay? College basically mimics the same way we teach people in elementary school, which is not the way that it should be taught. And historically, it wasn't the way that it was taught. We have very much focused on integrating political ideology with the way that we teach higher education. And there's basically two camps of it. You go to a Christian private academy, and you have to conform to the religious viewpoints of that denomination, which often is some brand of Christian nationalism, Christian identity formulation. Now, of course, not all Christian academies are this way. Some of them are a little bit more liberal, not liberal politics, but liberal religion, in the sense that they're part of things like Reformed Judaism or non-evangelical Protestantism. So these aren't the majority of Christian universities, though. The other part, the much larger part, which is in our public universities, is, in my opinion, based on critical theory-derived frameworks that became super popular in the 1980s. The specific example, what I mean is critical theory isn't the same thing as critical race theory that you constantly hear. Critical race theory is derived from critical theory. Critical theory started back in the early 20th century. It's a Marxist school of thought that tries to basically merge scientific-ish language with Marxist theory. And it's called critical theory. And it's very, it's not accurate. It's more on the sociological aspect of things, but it's anti-positivist in the sense that it rejects the idea that we can use the empirical method to investigate social issues. And instead, social issues are best investigated in by looking at people's lived experiences and their narratives that they construct around their identity. That's a simple way of explaining it, and I think it's an accurate way to explain it. And what happened is that over the 50-something years since it was created, it started getting adopted by a lot of Marxist revolutionaries to justify their bullshit. As an example, black separatism of the 1960s and 70s, which was favored by people like Malcolm X, a lot of that language got reformed in a way through the lens of critical theory and became critical race theory to justify their black separatist ideologies. And it isn't based in science. So we have a lot of people in feminism, for example. What's called third and fourth wave feminism is a critical theory derived framework, where it's just not focusing on empirical observations like you would in most science, I should say all science, but especially with the sociological, supposed social sciences, that's primarily empirical based, but critical theory says it's wrong. And then people try to use sociological studies like from psychiatry to justify their critical race theories, and you just go down this crazy rabbit hole if we keep talking about it. But the point I'm trying to stress here is that a lot of people in academia are teaching that in things that have nothing to do with politics, inherently to do with political theory. They're applying these frameworks that are not based in a more mainstream view of history to things like history, and then you end up with all these people who are part of these Marxist-derived critical theory groups who are out in the streets right now, as I talk, fighting with ICE agents because they think that they are violating their supposed human rights by taking people who are illegally in the United States out of the country and deporting them back to their home of origin, which is something that literally every nation on the planet does when people are found who are not supposed to be in their countries, who are not legally supposed to be there. And we can go down a whole rabbit hole of why immigration is necessary. The most basic is that you don't want people in your country who aren't contributing to it, might be committing crimes, or simply the fact that if you have too many people who are from outside of your country in your nation, that increases the price of housing because it takes away housing from people who are lawfully in the country. Those people aren't just living on the streets, they're living somewhere. So it's very difficult to balance your economy if you have unrestricted immigration. And this is something that's been practiced in literally every country that's ever existed. And yet we have people in the streets fighting over this right now, which is just wrong. And the reason they're doing it is because, again, they're falling in these lower stages of thinking. They're not making decisions based upon actual assessment of facts. They're based on whether or not it's popular with the group that I want to conform with or that I want to be part of. So, higher stages. The bare minimum that you need for people who are adults, who are voting members of society in a republic such as the United States, is stage 5. The bare minimum. This is the bare minimum, folks. You gotta be, the majority of the population has to be this, or a republic doesn't work. It starts collapsing like ours is collapsing. Okay? The focus has to be on evidence. The focus has to be on evidence. Now, these people they'll stop saying truth isn't just whatever my peer group says. They'll say truth is what can be proven. And what they mean by proven starts adhering to objective rules in the sense of empiricism, the scientific method, and things like that. But these people are still not quite there because truth isn't what can be proven. It's more accurate to say we should believe things to be true if they can withstand scrutiny. That's the way we should think about it, because just because we may not have all the facts about a situation, it's important to distinguish this. So people who are in the stage 5, they're better than people who just believe whatever's popular, but they're not quite there. But it's enough that you can have a functional republic with just these people who are able to apply a method like the scientific method to investigate facts and decide whether or not things should be believed or not, okay? And they don't inherently take critical feedback to their statements as a personal attack. They don't fly off the hinges when you tell them that they're wrong. They're able to articulate their beliefs without losing their fucking minds. Now, the scientific method is not itself able to create moral claims. This is very important. It's called value-fact distinction in science. But the belief, the personal belief that a person has that the scientific method is a good way to find truth, that is an inherently moral statement. You're making a statement of value, that you value the scientific method as a tool to find truth. And this is an important distinction. So it's the opposite of just a dogmatic belief, which is what people in the earlier stages, the more childish stages of 3 and 4 are thinking. Okay? I can look at a method and say this is a good method to use with the scientific method, and I can justify that in a way that can be seen as a universal fact by other people. This is very important to understand about these higher stages. Okay? Just because you're using the scientific method doesn't mean you can make moral facts from it. And the belief that the scientific method is a good method is itself reflective of a moral belief. So the next stage above is the individualist, where ideally I would think we would have a great society if most people were in this category, which is basically where people can understand clearly that facts, interpretations aren't the same thing. That just because you can interpret a sentence one way does not mean that sentence was meant to communicate that idea, or that it inherently does communicate that idea. Okay? We have a big problem right now with relativism in society, which is again based on critical theory, based narratives or truth, right? Where I can win every debate just by reframing the meaning of words to suit my argument. And that doesn't make for any sensible outlook, because you're always going to be in conflict with people who disagree with you. And that just forms more common enemy frameworks. And it doesn't even adhere to reality, because just because you could write a sentence doesn't make it true. You know, that the whole Harry Potter book is not based in facts just because somebody wrote a bunch of sentences about Harry Potter and all these adventures he supposedly had. It's a work of fiction. The problem with relativism is it often confuses critical thinking with creative writing. These are different things. What you write needs to be based in observable, independent facts that your writing has to be able to be in alignment with. You can't say something is both true and false, for example. That's a contradiction. It violates the law of excluded middle, because a thing has to be equal to itself. This often comes up in debates with critical theorists and relativists. They want to define a word one way, even though that definition don't make a lick of sense, doesn't conform to the way the word is commonly used to communicate that idea, and therefore isn't reflective of the original justifications for the meaning of that word based in what was observed by the people who invented that word. And I know I'm being super vague there, but I think that you probably can imagine exact cases in your own life where this has happened, where people are trying to redefine something like racism to mean it can only be something that white people make, even though the word racism wasn't exclusively meant to justify just people who are Caucasian, prejudice against black people. Okay? There's racism in lots of countries that don't have any people, well, not any people, but certainly do not have a large portion of their people who are Caucasians. Japanese people are extremely racist, generally speaking, against people who are not Japanese. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're immoral, but if you go to Japan and you're any race other than, or I should say ethnicity, other than Japanese, and you want to use some of their spas, you want to go to their famous resorts and go into the baths, they won't let you in if you're not Japanese, and it's perfectly legal for them to prevent you from going in. And the reason why they don't want people who are not Japanese in there isn't because they think everybody else is dirty. It's because there are certain cultural rules with public bathing in Japan that unless you really dedicate yourself to studying that, you don't know it. You don't know the cultural norms and behaviors. And Japanese society is extremely well structured. But the fact of the matter is that these are racist policies because they do discriminate against people who are not Japanese by assuming because you're not Japanese, you don't know anything about their culture and how to adhere and how to behave in the public bath. And I would even agree with that assessment. That's probably true. If most people who are not Japanese don't know how to behave in public places like a public bath in Japan. It's still racism, however. Okay, so that's just an example. Racism is not just exclusively Caucasians against everybody else. Lots of people of other ethnicities can also be racist against other people too. But a lot of people try to redefine these things to win ideological debates to justify, ironically enough, their own racism against people who are Caucasian. But setting all of that aside, okay, it's very important to understand that when you get to the higher levels of thinking as a person, you can do exactly what I just said. You can say that yes, something is racist and understand the motivations of the person who is a racist. You can understand their reasonings and even agree with some of their reasonings that they have some legitimate merit to them, but still recognize that what they're doing is racism. Okay? And that's the difference between myself, who does operate at a higher emotional development stage, and people who are at the lower stages who would either say, well, no, Japanese people can't be racist because they're not Caucasians, and go down that circular reasoning rabbit hole, or people who say, well, that's not a fact because just because these people are racist doesn't mean that they have to have legitimate cause, because racism can never be based in any legitimate purpose, even though everybody forms a belief because they think there's a justifiable reason for it. There's nobody on this world who doesn't have some justification for why they believe the things that they believe, okay? And often it's the case that their justifications are based on real observations. But that doesn't necessarily mean those observations are ethically justifiable. And that's the difference. And that's what people who are at the lower stages, stage 3 and 4, can't understand. Let's move on. Conflict resolution. Developmental stages between someone who is at a higher stage, stage 5 plus, and people in stage 3, very, very different, okay? These people are focused just on outrage and defense and blame shifting, and they're just focused on trying to get victory for their group, and they're trying to rack up wins because in their mind there's some invisible brownie point system where the more things I say that are right and the more applause I get from people who agree with me, the better I am at life or some other thing. And they focus very much on using shame and other means of force, authoritarianism even, to get their way. Okay? That's very common behavior. And of course, that's exactly what we see in society. We see it in, again, these social activist groups, which are, unfortunately, we have to be upfront about this. It's the Democrat Party lost an election. They lost to Donald Trump. They don't like Donald Trump's policies because he's a Republican. Doesn't matter if he's literally doing the exact same thing Democrat presidents did before Biden. Obama also deported millions of people who weren't in the country legally as well. Clinton did. All of the Democrat presidents who have ever been in this country have enforced the same immigration laws we have right now. But because Donald Trump is now doing it, they need to violently protest against him because he's supposedly a fascist or something. This is all based in lower stages of thinking. And then you have post-conventional stages, okay? People who are more interested in finding truth than they are in trying to be correct. They want, and that's very different, okay? Trying to be correct, trying to feel like I'm correct, trying to convince other people that I'm correct is not the same thing as actually finding what is true. These are different behaviors, and they're different goals. Because if you have truth, then you can create real solutions that solve problems. And I think that the number one failure of both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party right now in America is that they're too focused on trying to win the applause and approval of their peer groups, and they're not trying to actually find real solutions to the problems. And in many cases, they'll deny that the problem even exists in the first place. But the reality is that we do have housing crisis in the United States. We have the housing crisis in the United States because, we've got millions of people here who shouldn't be here. That's one problem. We have millions of people in the job market who are getting paid under the table. So it's impossible for us to use things like minimum wage to ensure people have a minimum standard of living that they can have a nice life if they're legally in the country, when you've got millions of people in this country who are getting money under the table, being exploited, or just shouldn't be participating in the market in the first place. Then you also have the problem of crime, where crime's not being punished the way that it needs to in order to deter future behavior or remove dangerous people from society. So we're letting people who literally have assaulted people out onto the streets because they were able to post a bail they should have never had in the first place, to go on out and assault more people, or even murder people or rape people within days of them being released back onto the streets. Those are problems. Those are real social problems that are not getting solutions because, unfortunately, some politicians are trying to say the right things to win applause from people who agree with them saying the supposed right things, instead of creating real solutions based in the truth and facts. All right? So the tools of people who are thinking more critically is logic, pragmatism, scientific method. Right? It's not just based in trying to shame people into silence, like with lower stages. The other problem that we have is just because you know about these higher stages, just because you know about things that are the tools of higher stages, like critical thinking, like logic, like the scientific method, doesn't mean you are able to actually employ these things in a regular basis in your life. Again, this comes from the difference between vertical growth and horizontal growth, okay? There's a difference between teaching people information and people able to actually understand that information. Let's go back to my analogy of the operating system. If your smartphone is operating on DOS, you can't install ChatGPT, okay? You can't install these higher tools into your operating system, into your worldview, into your daily practice, if you can't even understand them in the first place. If you can't understand why the scientific method is a good method for finding truth, then you're not going to be able to use the scientific method to find truth because you don't understand how it even works. You can't articulate the stages of the scientific method. You can't understand that it's a feedback loop where just because you did one study and had one conclusion from that study doesn't make it science. You have to have repeatability of your studies. You have to be able to reproduce that study with brand new raw data and arrive at the same conclusion. And other people have to be able to do that too. And a lot of people don't understand that, who are operating at the lower stages. So they think just because I did one scientific study, that means I use the scientific method, which is bullshit. That's not science. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people who are publishing scientific papers into scientific journals, which can't be reproduced. This is called the reproducibility crisis, or the replication crisis, I should say, in sciences right now. You can look us up, you can Google it, replication crisis. The majority of studies that are published can't be reproduced by the people who publish the studies, let alone by other people. And that means a lot of what's getting published as supposed science ain't science. So, you have to know the difference between just being aware of information and being able to apply that information. So, just because you can pass a quiz on something like systemic injustice, but if you still behave with an us versus them tribal mindset, you're not actually able to understand that subject. Okay? Now, of course, this doesn't mean that just because you have to agree with every study that you come across, or that you have to agree with all of the frameworks. But what it does mean is that if your ability to determine right and wrong only is reflected by the people that you're around who also think of what's right and wrong in the same way you do, and you're not able to step outside of that group and evaluate claims independently, then how are you possibly able to accurately assess whether the viewpoints of people outside of that peer group you're stuck in are right or wrong, if you can't separate your definition for right and wrong away from that peer group? That's an important distinction, and it's something a lot of people don't think about. So, we need to get people into these post-conventional later stages of development. We need to get people into at least being an individualist, okay? At least into being able to handle ambiguity and recognize the context of statements, and that we shouldn't just say things are right because they were written down in a book somebody wrote that we respect. Okay? We need to actually criticize and review what it is people say. We need to be able to understand that there's paradoxes in statements sometimes, and be able to manage the complexity therein. We need to be able to be guided by universal principles instead of just whatever our peer group is saying is right and wrong. Okay? We can't have a functional republic if we don't have the majority of the population doing this. Because if the majority of the population are people who only think right and wrong is whatever their group says, that's the tyranny of the majority that our system was supposed to stop, and unfortunately isn't doing a good job of. So how do we fix this? I know, a very long presentation, but it's very important. How do we fix this? Well, we need to teach people how to be more emotionally developed in the classroom, okay? We have to use a scientific-based process. Not the scientific is not science-like, but not exactly science. We need to have a feedback loop is what I'm trying to say. And that's what this illustration is articulating, okay? We need to challenge people. We need to give them the guidance. We need to point out when they're just making definitions of what's right and wrong based on an appeal to authority or appeal to popularity, instead of basing on a critical examination of the facts. There's tools within ego development for doing this. There's what's called the Maturity Assessment Profile, or MAP, which helps establish where a person's current maturity level is at the moment. And then you can use that information, that assessment, to get them to reach the next stage, basically. A person really can't just jump stages. You have to go through the stages. You can't just jump through them, unfortunately. So before you can get a person to understand that the scientific method can't actually make claims about what is right and morally wrong, you have to first teach them the scientific method as a legitimate tool. And then you have to teach them how the scientific method has limitations. This is one of the hurdles. This is, I think, one of the reasons why a lot of people get stuck at these lower stages, because we're not educating people enough about the limitations of things. We're just teaching them to memorize what's in a textbook, and they're not actually able to articulate how any of the information in that textbook actually got there in the first place. So, again, as I've articulated before, we need to have dramatic improvement to our education system. We need to change the way that we teach. So it's not just about rote memorization of facts, but we're also guiding people through emotional development stages. And that does require people at home to teach their own children this stage's development too, these stage developments as well, okay? And of course, I think that's very frustrated. The number one hurdle for this is that a lot of parents are stuck at these lower stages themselves. So how could they possibly help their kids get over these stages? And the only solution I have to this is that we have to find a way to get this information to the people that need it the most, which are the people who are parents of younger children. We've got to get people who are parents to understand if they are stuck in these lower stages of ego development that are holding them back from raising their own children to be better equipped for living and thriving in our republic than they are themselves at this moment. Instead of thinking that your children are just stupider versions of yourself, you've got to start viewing your children as an investment for the future, someone who needs to surpass you as a person, that needs to become smarter than you, that needs to become more successful than you. That's the way that we need to change perceptions of parents. And that's a very hard task to do. And it's not going to happen overnight, but it's something that needs to be done if we're ever going to get ourselves out of this mess. We have to change how parents think about parenting. We have to change how the schools view and treat parents. Parents need to be held accountable if they're not helping their kids advance to higher ego development stages that are necessary for teachers to be able to teach their children. If you have children who are so immature they won't even listen to the teacher and they're already in high school, that's a big problem. And it needs a solution. And it can't just be regulated. It's a cultural problem that we have to address. And that's, of course, the thesis of an entire chapter of my book, which you should definitely read. I'm going to leave you with this quote from that book that sums up everything I've talked about here. The measure of success for an education system is not how many facts students can recite, but how well they think, how fairly they argue, and how reliably they act with virtue when acting in alignment with truth is costly. This is in my book, Common Humanity, and I want you to read it. It's not a very expensive book. It's free if you have Kindle Unlimited. If you don't have Kindle Unlimited, it's a $3 Kindle purchase. The paperback isn't expensive either. Read this book. It's going to change your life. It's going to help us change society. If you made it to the end of this presentation, I applaud you. It's been a lengthy one, but it's been an important one. Let me know what you think in the comments. And good luck.